The Toxan flagship, Fury's End, drifted silently in the void, its hull scarred by the last assault of the Tsar. The faint light from a dying star illuminated the bridge, casting a cold red glow across the crew. Captain Darnak stood motionless, eyes fixed on the vast darkness ahead. The crew moved like shadows, silent, tired, defeated. "Damage report!" Darnak's voice broke the stillness, low but firm. Sergeant Volan looked at the screens, his face grim. "Shields at 10%. Weapons arrays offline. We can jump, but we can't fight." The captain's jaw tightened. There was nothing left. The fleet had been shattered, their ships outgunned and outmanned. Only a few Toxan vessels remained, and their strength was fading fast. The Fury's End had once been a force to be reckoned with. Now it was barely holding together. Through the viewport, Darnak saw the dim light of the star flicker, casting a fleeting, sickly glow across the vast blackness of space. It was the last trace of hope, a dying ember in the endless night. He turned slowly, his eyes drifting to the communications panel in the center of the room. A single blinking light, steady and relentless, mocked him. The distress signal had been sent weeks ago. No response. "Captain," Lieutenant Malin said, his voice barely audible. "We can't keep running. They'll find us. It's only a matter of time." Darnak met Malin's gaze. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. The Tsar fleet was closing in, and the Toxans had no more tricks to play, no more plans to offer, just desperation. "We need to make one final call," Darnak muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Malin's brow furrowed. "Who's left to call, Captain?" The captain's fingers hovered above the communication panel. The Deathworlders. They were nothing but a legend, a race spoken of in whispers. Ruthless, unstoppable warriors. But were they real? And if they were, would they answer? "Prepare the distress signal," Darnak said. His voice was steady despite the storm in his chest. "Send it to the legends. We have nothing left to lose." A soft beep from the console signaled the signal was ready. His hand lingered over the button, the gravity of the moment thick in the air. Silence enveloped the bridge. The crew watched him, waiting, their eyes filled with quiet hope. With one final glance at the crew, exhausted, defeated but still loyal, Darnak pressed the button. His words cut through the stillness of the bridge, carrying the weight of his people's survival. "If you are out there, we need help. The Tsar are upon us. We have no strength left. If you can hear us, we beg you to come." The ship fell silent once more. The crew waited. Nothing more to do now but hope. Darnak stood motionless, the cold of space pressing in on him, his mind a whirlwind of uncertainty. Would they come? Or had the Deathworlders been nothing more than a myth? The signal was sent. And now the waiting began. Captain Darnak stood motionless, staring at the blank communication panel as though willing it to life. Every inch of his body felt heavy, as if the weight of the galaxy had fallen squarely on his shoulders. The stars outside the viewport seemed to mock him, distant, unreachable, cold. His hands clenched the railing, his knuckles white as his mind circled around the one question that gnawed at him. Would they answer? A faint vibration through the deck made him glance toward the tactical station. It was almost imperceptible, like the fleeting pressure of a passing storm, but it reminded him of just how fragile their position was. The Tsar were coming. The fleet was cornered. There were no more battles to fight, just a slow, inevitable end. He turned away from the console, unable to look at it anymore. "Captain," Malin's voice cut through the silence, low and calm. He stood at his station, fingers tapping a rhythm of their own on the console. "The signal, it's out. We can't do more than wait." Darnak's eyes locked on his lieutenant. Malin was not the kind to wear his heart on his sleeve, but Darnak could see it in his eyes. The same fear, the same resignation that gnawed at the edges of every Toxan officer. Malin's gaze flicked to the viewport, where the dying star barely held onto its light. "If they don't come," Malin murmured, "what do we do?" Darnak swallowed hard. He had no answer. The bridge was quiet again. Only the soft taps of fingers on screens and the steady rhythmic beat of the ship's pulse filling the air. A low thrum, nothing like the rumbles of a warship, but something more fragile, like the last desperate gasp of a dying creature. It felt as though every second stretched longer than the last. The crew waited, their faces unreadable as the silence stretched on. Even the low flicker of the dying star outside offered no comfort. Darnak could feel the pulse of the Fury's End beneath his feet, but it was weaker now. The ship had given all it could. The crew had too. And then, the silence shattered. The communications console blinked, flickering at first, then steady, a steady pulse that vibrated through the ship, a signal. But this was no ordinary message. This wasn't a distress call, nor a warning. This was an answer. Darnak's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His breath caught in his throat as his fingers hovered over the console. The whole bridge held its breath. The crew leaned in. Every one of them knew what this could mean. "Play it," Darnak commanded, his voice sharp as ice. The screen flickered and a voice crackled through the speakers. It was low, distant, but unmistakable, an edge of power laced in every syllable. "We received your plea. We are coming." The words were simple. The meaning was anything but. Darnak felt a shiver run down his spine. He had always known the legends. He had always heard the stories. But hearing those words, the promise of salvation from a force unlike any other, he had never truly believed, until now. "Prepare for incoming forces," Darnak ordered, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "We're not finished yet." Around him the crew stirred, but there was no elation. Just a cold, quiet determination. They had made it this far. Now, they had to survive what came next. Through the viewport, the stars seemed to shimmer, distant and untouched. The unknown was coming. The words hung in the air long after the message had ended. The crew, standing rigid at their posts, could only stare at the blank screen as if waiting for more, as if expecting the universe itself to suddenly reveal its next move. The captain didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the stars beyond the viewport, though his mind was far from the peaceful expanse of space. Every star now felt distant, uncaring, cold. For a moment, it was as if the ship had stopped moving altogether, held in place by the weight of uncertainty. The message had been brief, almost too brief, yet it carried the promise of a new force, an unstoppable power. "Who are they?" Lieutenant Mallon's voice broke the silence. His words were soft but sharp with doubt, the same question that lingered in the mind of every officer present. Darnak's eyes slowly shifted toward him, locking onto Mallon's, but he didn't answer right away. His thoughts were tangled. The Deathworlders were no myth, he had known that much. But to actually feel their presence, it was too much. "We'll find out soon enough," Darnak muttered, his voice quiet but resolute. He didn't want to admit it, but the sudden unknown had twisted something deep inside him, something he had buried a long time ago. The uncertainty clawed at him, threatened to unravel him, but he couldn't let it show, not now. The ship drifted onward, its path slow and deliberate. The engines seemed almost to strain against the pull of the void, as though even they understood that time was no longer a luxury. Darnak moved toward the command station, his boots clicking softly against the metal floor. He touched the cold console with fingers that seemed to tremble despite his best efforts to stay still. The crew's eyes flickered toward him, waiting for some sign, some directive. But he couldn't give them that yet. Not until he knew what came next. The transmission had promised help, but the question was, help for what? The Toxans were fighting a war they couldn't win. The Tsar had already slaughtered so many of their kind, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. And now, just as all seemed lost, the Deathworlders would arrive. But what would they do? Would they save the Toxans, or simply erase them, like they had done with every enemy before? The legends spoke of their brutality, their merciless tactics. Could they trust these strangers? The ship shuddered once, and Darnak's gaze snapped toward the sensor readouts. It was small, but unmistakable. A signal, a presence. The Deathworlders were coming faster than anyone had anticipated. His chest tightened. No one on the bridge moved. No one spoke. It was as if the crew collectively held its breath, not sure whether to prepare for battle or for some kind of salvation. The minutes crawled by, each one stretched thin with the weight of the unknown. "Shields up!" Darnak finally commanded, his voice calm, yet filled with an urgency he hadn't felt before. "Prepare for contact." The crew sprang into action, their movements fluid, sharp, their fear kept in check by the gravity of their orders. They had been trained for moments like this, even if they hadn't known what it would feel like. The tension in the room tightened with every passing second, the cold metal of the ship pressing in from all sides. It was the quiet before the storm, the waiting game that had defined their existence for so long. Only now it felt different. Something was coming. And this time, it wasn't the Tsar. Outside the viewport, the stars remained distant, but in the pit of Darnak's stomach, he could feel it, a shift in the cosmos itself, like a heavy tide just before the wave crashed. The Deathworlders were out there, but would they arrive in time? Would they truly help? Or had their ship already sailed, leaving the Toxans to face their fate alone? The answers lay beyond the stars. The shockwave passed, and the stars outside seemed to hold their breath. The Deathworlder fleet had arrived, but there was no cheer, no relief. Instead, the tension on the bridge grew heavier, like a storm pressing down on the ship. Captain Darnak stood frozen, his eyes scanning the black void beyond. The enemy was close now. The Tsar fleet, which had once seemed so invincible, was preparing for their final move. But the Deathworlders, who were they? What was their true intent? The first salvo of fire erupted from the Deathworlders, a precise burst that tore through the void with terrifying accuracy. The Tsar fleet reacted immediately, scrambling to reposition. The deafening crackle of energy blasts filled the air, sending shockwaves through the ship. The Fury's End shuddered under the distant impact, but Darnak remained rooted to his spot, his mind racing. "They're efficient," Malin said under his breath, his eyes glued to the tactical display. "Almost too efficient." Darnak's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't afford to let his thoughts wander. The Deathworlders' ships moved like living predators, each one a silent force of nature, cutting through the Tsar's defenses with brutal precision. It was a sight to behold, one that Darnak couldn't quite wrap his mind around. These weren't just warriors. They were something else entirely, something that bent the very fabric of warfare to their will. Another series of blasts rocked the bridge, but this time the sound was different, more distant, almost muffled. Darnak's eyes darted to the sensors. The Deathworlders weren't just attacking. They were surrounding the Tsar fleet, closing in from all angles. They were making sure the enemy had no escape. "Lieutenant, report!" Darnak barked, his voice sharp. Malin's fingers flew over the console, but his expression remained neutral. "They're outgunned, Captain. The Tsar are trying to regroup, but they're falling apart. The Deathworlders, they're moving faster than we can track." Darnak's heart raced. The Deathworlders weren't fighting like any force he had ever seen. There was no hesitation, no delay between orders and execution. It was as if the entire fleet was one entity, moving as if they had been forged for this very moment. And yet, despite the overwhelming power they wielded, Darnak couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Deathworlders were relentless, too relentless. There was no mercy, no quarter given. Suddenly the tactical display flickered, and a strange signal appeared, a faint pulse, almost hidden beneath the noise of battle. Darnak's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. This was different from the usual chatter, far too clean, far too deliberate. His pulse quickened as the thought hit him. "This isn't just a battle," Darnak muttered to himself. His voice was low, barely audible over the crackle of ongoing fire. "There's something else going on here." "Captain?" Volan's voice cut through, barely above a whisper. He was standing by the sensor array, his face pale. "There's more. Something's coming." Darnak's chest tightened. The crew had no time to process it. There was no room for hesitation. He couldn't afford to focus on the deeper mystery. Not now. "Focus on the Tsar," he said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "We need to end this now." But as the battle raged on outside, Darnak couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that the Deathworlders weren't just here to help. They were here for something else, something he couldn't yet see. The message they'd sent earlier had been too simple, too final. They were coming, but why? And what would they do when the fight was over? The mystery thickened, pulling the captain deeper into a web he didn't yet understand. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was thick with unanswered questions. The stars beyond the viewport seemed unchanged, distant, cold, indifferent. But inside the Fury's End, everything had shifted. The Deathworlders had obliterated the Tsar with terrifying precision, yet their overwhelming presence hung like a shadow over the bridge. The air in the command room felt heavier, as though the very fabric of space itself was holding its breath. Darnak stood motionless, his eyes locked on the space outside, the faint glow of distant stars casting ghostly reflections across the glass. "Captain," Malin's voice broke through, low but insistent. "What now?" Darnak turned slowly, his gaze cutting across the crew. They were all waiting for an answer that he didn't have. The Deathworlders had answered their distress call with violent efficiency. But what did it mean? They had saved them, yes, but that was the easy part. The real question was what the Deathworlders wanted from the Toxans. Their motives remained shrouded in mystery, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. "Prepare for communication," Darnak said, his voice steady, but his mind was racing. The moment they let their guard down would be the moment they realized just how little they understood the forces they had summoned. The crew shifted into action, their movements sharp but cautious. Darnak's thoughts spun as he walked toward the communications panel. The Deathworlders had done more than annihilate the Tsar. They had shown up without a word, without any sign of negotiation. What kind of creatures were they? Were they even truly alive, or something beyond life as the Toxans understood it? A sudden flash on the sensor screen interrupted his thoughts. Darnak froze. The faint pulse of a signal, something hidden beneath the static, appeared on the screen. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His heart rate quickened as he leaned in, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't the usual communication or enemy interference. This was different. "Captain," Sergeant Volan said, his voice edged with tension. "There's something coming in. Something close." Darnak's chest tightened. The Deathworlders had left no room for error, no room for second guesses. They had destroyed the Tsar with a speed and force that defied comprehension. But now there was something else, something they weren't prepared for. The pulse on the sensor screen flickered again, this time stronger. It wasn't an attack, not yet, but it was a message, unmistakable in its urgency. Darnak's mind raced, but he held himself steady. His crew watched him, waiting for orders, but he didn't know what to tell them. "Track it," Darnak commanded, his voice calm, despite the storm inside his mind. The sensor panel displayed a series of coordinates, a trajectory heading straight for the Toxan fleet. It was the Deathworlders, without a doubt, but what did they want now? Had they already made their intentions clear? Or was this something else entirely? As the coordinates locked in, Darnak felt a strange shiver run through him. This wasn't a traditional confrontation. This was something different. The Deathworlders weren't just powerful. They were a force beyond comprehension, an unknown entity that was playing by rules the Toxans didn't even know existed. The crew shifted uncomfortably, the air in the room growing thick with tension. Every person on the bridge knew that the next few moments could define the fate of their entire species, but none of them could guess what would come next. "All stations report," Darnak ordered. "Prepare for the worst. If they're coming, they'll come fast." His fingers gripped the armrest of his command chair, the cold metal pressing into his skin. He was no longer sure if the Fury's End was his ship, or if it had become a pawn in a much larger game. As the signal approached, a strange electric hum filled the room, but it wasn't the ship. It was something beyond their control, something that seemed to vibrate from the very space around them. The mystery had only just begun. The tension in the bridge was palpable, a thick, almost suffocating weight that pressed down on every member of the crew. The faint glow of distant stars barely illuminated the room, and the Fury's End seemed to exhale in time with the heavy breaths of the officers surrounding Captain Darnak. The faint pulse of the incoming signal was now constant, rhythmic, like the beating of a heart that could not be ignored. Darnak stood motionless, his hands clenched at his sides, unwilling to turn away from the viewport as the mystery unfolded before him. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing through his bones. The unknown had arrived, but what was it? "Captain," Malin's voice cut through the silence, sharp and measured. "We're running out of time. The signal's getting stronger. It's heading straight for us." Darnak's gaze flicked to the sensor panel. The coordinates were locked in, the trajectory unmistakable. Something was coming, something that had the power to change everything. But what? The Deathworlders were still the great unknown, their motives still hidden beneath layers of enigma. And now, there was this pulse, stronger with every passing moment and growing more urgent. "Status on the fleet," Darnak said, his voice cold, though his insides churned with unease. Sergeant Volan's fingers danced across the console, his brow furrowed in concentration. "All ships in position, Captain. But—" He hesitated, eyes scanning the readouts. "The pulse. It's interfering with the fleet's systems. Communication channels are breaking down. We're losing contact with some of the smaller ships." The words hit Darnak like a slap. The pulse wasn't just a signal. It was a disturbance, spreading outward, cutting them off from their own forces. The Fury's End was losing its grip on reality, as if something was warping the very space around them. A shiver ran down Darnak's spine. If the Deathworlders had wanted to end this quickly, they could have. Instead, they had arrived with a deliberate, unsettling pace. Now they were testing the Toxans, pushing them into unknown territory. A sharp crackle over the intercom pulled Darnak's attention back to the immediate danger. The voice that came through was distorted, warped by static and the interference from the pulse, but unmistakable. The words were simple, their meaning undeniable. "We are here. Prepare." The message was short, final. But the chill that ran through Darnak's veins was far from simple. The Deathworlders hadn't made a threat. They hadn't demanded surrender. They simply stated their presence, as if they were waiting for the Toxans to prove something. "Prepare for what?" Malin muttered, barely audible. But the fear in his voice was unmistakable. Darnak turned toward him, his eyes steely. "We're about to find out." The pulse on the sensors grew stronger, the readings now overwhelming the consoles. Volan's hands flew over the buttons, but nothing responded. The ship seemed to lose its connection to the very fabric of space as the pulse wrapped itself around them, squeezing tighter. The crew remained frozen, their eyes wide with anticipation and dread. The weight of it pressed on them all, and then, without warning, the ship lurched. The entire vessel groaned as if it had been struck from all sides. The walls seemed to vibrate with the force of something unseen, something that hadn't touched them physically, but that was more powerful than any weapon. Darnak gripped the edge of his console, fighting the sudden disorientation that gripped his mind. The air felt thick, charged. He could hear the faintest scrape of metal on metal, the groan of the ship's frame straining under the invisible pressure. "What is happening?" Volan hissed. The stars outside were blotted out by a sudden darkness, a shadow sweeping over them. It was impossible, unnatural. The Deathworlders had arrived, and now they were not just in their midst. They had shifted the very fabric of reality. Darnak knew one thing for certain. They were no longer in control. Whatever was coming next, it would not be something they could predict. The Fury's End groaned, a low, desperate sound that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the ship. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable, as if the space itself had thickened, a cold pressure settling in the air. Captain Darnak stood rigid, his mind reeling as the deck trembled beneath his boots. The stars had vanished, swallowed by an impenetrable blackness that spread like ink through water. Nothing felt real anymore. Nothing but the suffocating presence of the unknown that had descended upon them. "Captain," Lieutenant Malin's voice was steady, but it barely cut through the thick tension that hung in the air. "The fleet is still in formation. Communication channels are dead, but we're not alone. Something's closing in." Darnak's eyes flicked to the sensor panel. The pulse was still there, but it had changed, distorted into something even more complex, like a beacon they couldn't ignore. It wasn't an attack, not yet, but it was a presence, far too powerful to be anything else. The Deathworlders had arrived, and now the ship felt like it was inside their grasp, held motionless by an invisible hand. "Nothing on the radar," Sergeant Volan murmured, his fingers hovering over the display, his face pale as he searched for any sign of movement. "The pulse is blocking everything. We can't track anything outside." Darnak clenched his jaw, the silence amplifying the creaks of the ship, the sharp clicks of the console. The air was thick with static. The very walls of the Fury's End seemed to stretch under an invisible force. It was as though the ship had been cast adrift in a sea of uncertainty, its instruments no longer responding to the flow of the universe outside. The stars, once distant and reassuring, had disappeared, leaving only the dark void that seemed to pulse with energy. "What are they doing?" Malin said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, unanswered. Darnak's eyes narrowed as his gaze drifted to the crew, their expressions unreadable, each face lit by the flickering lights of the control panels. No one spoke, as if words were unnecessary in the face of what they were experiencing. Time felt suspended, caught between the anticipation of something that would come, but that no one knew how to define. There was only the weight of it, the overwhelming presence of the unknown that filled the ship like a second atmosphere. Suddenly, without warning, a sharp jolt shook the ship. The deck shifted under their feet, sending a tremor through their bones. The crew gripped their stations, bracing themselves against the sudden motion. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "Report!" Darnak snapped, his voice taut. Volan's fingers danced across the console, but his face was grim. "Shields are holding, but the system's unstable. This isn't just a wave of energy. Something's breaking through. It's—" A violent surge of force interrupted him, a rush of pressure that seemed to bend reality itself. Darnak's chest tightened as he fought to keep his bearings. The lights blinked out for a moment, leaving them in total darkness. Then, like a breath being exhaled from the universe itself, the ship's systems blinked back to life. But everything was different. The viewports were no longer filled with stars. Instead, there was a dark shape, vast and unyielding, swallowing the view. Something was coming. It was not the Deathworlders, but they were connected. Darnak could feel it, deep in his gut. "Something is here," Darnak muttered, his eyes locked on the massive silhouette approaching them, the edges of the ship shuddering with anticipation. But what? The pulse surged again, louder now, a deafening presence that threatened to tear through the Fury's End itself. The mystery was deepening, and Darnak knew with certainty that whatever was coming next would change everything. The Fury's End lurched again, its frame groaning as if it was being pulled by an unseen force. Captain Darnak's grip tightened on the console, the cold metal biting into his skin. The lights flickered once more, casting the crew's faces in sharp, unnatural shadows. They all remained motionless, staring out into the dark expanse beyond the viewport. The dark shape that had filled the view was now clearer, an enormous vessel, its surface shimmering with a strange energy. It wasn't a ship in the traditional sense. Its edges were jagged, almost crystalline, and it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to echo deep in their bones. "Is that the Deathworlders?" Malin's voice was taut with disbelief. The rest of the crew remained silent, their eyes fixed on the shape. But it wasn't the Deathworlders' ships. They had already proven their power. This was something else, something far more ancient, far more powerful, and it was heading straight for them. "Shut down all unnecessary systems," Darnak ordered, his voice a low command that carried no room for argument. "We don't know what we're dealing with yet." Volan moved to comply, his fingers moving swiftly across the control panel, but his eyes never left the viewport. "It's too close, Captain. I can't get a lock on it. The systems are still scrambling." The ship seemed to vibrate under the weight of the unknown force now pressing upon them. There was a strange, unrelenting pressure in the air, as though the very atmosphere was being compressed. Darnak could feel it in his chest, the air thickening, every breath harder to take. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he strained his eyes to make sense of the shifting shape ahead. It moved slowly, but purposefully, like a predator toying with its prey. A soft clicking sound echoed from the comms panel, a sharp contrast to the heavy silence. "Captain," Volan said, his voice edged with unease. "I'm getting a signal. It's coming from that thing. It's not the Deathworlders." Darnak turned sharply toward him. "What is it?" "I don't know, sir." Volan's hands hovered uncertainly over the console. "It's encrypted, unlike anything we've seen before. It's not a distress signal, not a threat. It's waiting." Darnak's stomach tightened. "Waiting for what?" Before Volan could answer, the signal intensified. The air around them seemed to thrum, a low, almost imperceptible pulse that resonated deep within the walls of the ship. The Fury's end trembled as if it had caught the beat of some ancient cosmic rhythm. And then the voice came, low and rumbling, like the crackle of distant thunder. "You are not the first." The words echoed in the air, reverberating through the ship, though they hadn't come from any speaker. It was as if the voice itself had seeped into their minds, the sound reverberating within their skulls. Darnak felt a chill spread through him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "What is that?" Malin whispered, his voice tight with fear. Darnak didn't answer. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what was happening. The Deathworlders had come, but they weren't the ultimate force in the galaxy. This was something else. And it wasn't here to play by the same rules. The unknown vessel had spoken, and its words were as much a threat as a warning. The crew waited, breathless, as the ship loomed ever closer, its energy pulse growing stronger, more overwhelming. The question that gnawed at Darnak's mind was clear. What had they truly unleashed upon themselves? And worse yet, who were they, really, to challenge it? The Fury's end groaned under the unseen pressure, its metal frame shuddering as though it were caught in the grip of something far more powerful than it had ever faced. Darnak's hands clenched the armrests, his fingers digging into the cold material as the ship trembled again. The vast shape outside the viewport loomed closer, almost consuming the view, its dark silhouette taking up the stars, blocking them out one by one. The air in the bridge grew thick, every breath heavy, as though the space around them was constricting, drawing in with an inescapable force. "They're forcing us in," Malin said, his voice low and tight, as though speaking too loudly might draw attention. His hands hovered above the sensors, yet nothing registered. The display was nothing but static. "Whatever that thing is, it's pulling us toward it." Darnak didn't answer at first. He didn't need to. He felt it in his bones, the relentless pressure, the unnatural force. The Fury's end wasn't just being held still. It was being drawn into a vast, consuming abyss, and the edge of that dark void was inching ever closer. "Adjust the trajectory," Darnak finally said, his voice sharp. "We have to fight back." Volan didn't move, his eyes locked onto the viewport. "Captain, the systems won't respond. We're not in control anymore." The words fell between them like an anchor, dragging Darnak's thoughts down into a well of uncertainty. The Deathworlder's presence had done nothing to stop this force. Instead, it was as if the universe itself was bending under the weight of something ancient, something far more powerful. They had been warned, but it was too late to turn back now. Their fate was sealed, and the ship was drifting closer to whatever waited in the dark. Another jolt surged through the ship, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a low rumble, like a growl in the distance, vibrating through the walls, reverberating deep in the core of the vessel. It wasn't just the ship responding. The very space around them seemed to pulse, a dark heartbeat that threatened to drown out the quiet thrum of their own existence. "Report!" Darnak barked, his eyes fixed on the eerie emptiness before them. "Nothing, sir," Malin replied, his voice strained. "The pulse has intensified. We're inside it now. Whatever this is, it's blocking everything. No comms, no radar, just this." The bridge was silent except for the faint scraping of metal as the Fury's end moved through the inescapable grip of the unknown force. The pressure was building, making Darnak's chest tighten, his heart pounding harder with each passing moment. Something was coming, but it wasn't just another fleet or weapon. It was an entity, a presence, far more ancient than the galaxy itself. They had been foolish to believe they understood the power they were dealing with. They had walked into something much larger, something that had no intention of letting them leave. A flicker of light, brief and ghostly, appeared on the edges of the viewport. Then it was gone. Darnak's breath caught. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but there, something was shifting. "We're not alone," Volan whispered, the words chilling Darnak to his core. The shape outside was moving, shifting, as though it were alive, reacting to their presence. And in the depths of that dark void, something stirred, waiting. The true mystery was unfolding, and Darnak had no idea what was going to happen next. But he could feel it, deep in his gut. The universe had just shifted again, and they were at the heart of it. The words, "You are not ready," lingered in the air, an oppressive weight pressing down on the crew. Darnak's heart thudded against his chest, each beat echoing in the suffocating silence that enveloped the bridge. His fingers twitched on the command console, as though he wanted to do something, anything. But no command seemed sufficient for the unknown that loomed before them. The strange vessel outside was still, suspended in the void, but its presence had already wrapped itself around them, its pulse now a constant hum in the depths of the ship. Captain Darnak's breath came in short bursts, as if the air itself had thickened. The walls seemed to press inward, the space around them feeling smaller with every passing second. There was no sound, nothing from the engines, nothing from the crew, just the feeling of being watched, of being drawn closer to something far greater than any of them could fathom. The ship groaned again, but this time the vibration was different. It wasn't mechanical. It felt like a shudder, as though the Fury's end was responding to something from the outside, its very structure bending to an unseen force. "Captain," Malin's voice was quiet, edged with a quiet terror that couldn't be concealed. "The signal. It's intensifying. I can feel it. This pressure, it's alive." Darnak turned to him, but his mind was already elsewhere. The bridge had become a cage, the crew's eyes darting nervously, unable to focus on any one thing. The unease in the air was palpable, seeping into their bones, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The strange entity outside was no longer just a presence. It was something alive, something that knew they were here, that they had come too far to turn back. "Shut everything down," Darnak ordered, his voice hoarse but firm. "We need to isolate ourselves from whatever this is. We cannot afford to be drawn in any further." Sergeant Volan immediately moved to comply, but the unspoken question lingered in the air. Would it even matter? The ship was no longer responding in ways they understood. The instruments flickered weakly, the display screen sputtering in and out of focus, unable to capture anything beyond the oppressive field that surrounded them. Then, as if on cue, the outside world seemed to shift. The void beyond the viewport thickened. The stars that had once flickered faintly now vanished altogether, swallowed by the growing darkness of the approaching force. It wasn't the darkness of empty space. This was something different, something deliberate, consuming. The ship's frame groaned again, louder this time, but not from any physical strain. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the universe itself, a deep vibration that resonated through the hull, through their bodies, shaking the foundation of everything they knew. Darnak's eyes widened as he saw it. A flash, small and distant at first, like the flare of a dying star. Then it grew, expanding outward in a spiral of energy. It wasn't light, it wasn't fire. It was something else, a pulse, a wave of force that moved with intent, that seemed to press against the very essence of existence itself. The pulse rippled through space, through time, and Darnak realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming for them. "Brace for impact!" Darnak shouted, but his voice was lost in the sudden deafening crack of energy that filled the room. It was no longer just an entity. It was something that could no longer be ignored. The Fury's end was at its mercy, and there was no way to know what would come next. The pulse crashed into the ship like a tidal wave, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The walls of the Fury's End groaned under the force, a low, threatening sound that reverberated through every deck. Darnak's hands gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white, as the bridge was consumed by a violent tremor. The air around them seemed to ripple, thickening with static, pressing in from every angle. There was no more pretending that this was just a moment of uncertainty. The threat was here, and it was unlike anything they had ever faced. "Captain!" Malin shouted, his voice strained. "We're caught in the pulse's field. I can't keep us stable. The ship's systems are failing." Darnak's mind raced. He could feel it now, the weight of the situation. The energy outside was so dense, so overwhelming, that their very ship was being drawn in, slowly but surely. Their options were dwindling. The crew had no weapons capable of disrupting this kind of force. There was no escaping it, but that didn't mean they had to submit. Darnak's mind shifted into a strategic mode, his thoughts turning inward, searching for anything they could use. "Shut down all unnecessary systems," Darnak barked, his voice sharp. "We need to isolate the critical functions. I want the shields recalibrated to maximum capacity, but only in specific quadrants. We can't afford a blanket shield. We need to contain the energy from that pulse, limit its spread." Volan's fingers flew across the panel, executing the orders with an almost mechanical precision, but the ship continued to groan as though it were resisting, as if the universe itself was fighting against their every move. The tension in the air was so thick it almost felt like the ship was suffocating, gasping for breath as it was drawn deeper into the unknown entity's pull. "We're running out of time," Sergeant Volan said, his voice rising with urgency. "The pulse is getting stronger, and the shields can only hold for so long." Darnak didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered from the viewport, the blackness outside now suffused with a strange glow, a pulse that moved with purpose. He knew that they could only maintain their position for a brief window before the energy would tear through them. Their best chance was to ride out the pulse, to survive long enough for something, anything, to shift in their favor. But even as he mentally mapped their options, a creeping doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What was this entity? What was its purpose? They had not been prepared for this. "Prepare for manual override," Darnak ordered. "All crew to stand by. We'll work with what we can control. We need to cut through this pulse. We need to break through it." Malin nodded, his face a mask of concentration as he adjusted the systems, locking the ship into a manual override. They couldn't trust the automated systems anymore. They had to fight against this pull with everything they had left. The pulse surged again. But this time, it was different. It didn't slam into them. It enveloped them, winding through the very structure of the ship like a living thing. But Darnak held firm. They weren't going to simply be pulled into the dark. They would fight every second until the mystery of this entity revealed itself, or until they were no longer able to resist. "Get ready," Darnak muttered under his breath, his mind already calculating their next move. "We'll either break free, or we'll face whatever comes next." The pulse slammed into the ship again, the shockwave reverberating through the hull with a force that rattled Darnak's teeth. The walls groaned in protest, the metal buckling under the pressure. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the ship were suffocating too, caught in the grip of some invisible force. Sweat clung to Darnak's brow as he gritted his teeth, refusing to give in to the rising tide of panic that clawed at the edges of his mind. They couldn't afford that now. His hands clenched tighter around the console, his eyes scanning the flickering screens before him. They needed a way out. "Captain, we're at our limit." Malin's voice cut through the growing tension, his face strained with the effort to maintain control. "The pulse is overriding everything. The ship's systems are barely holding." Darnak's mind raced, each second feeling like an eternity. The pulse wasn't just a disturbance. It was alive, sentient. The Fury's End was being drawn into its heart, into a space where logic no longer applied. But there was still a sliver of hope. The pulse was concentrated, a wave that came in cycles. If they could ride the ebb and flow, perhaps they could find a break in its constant assault, a moment of vulnerability. The ship might be fighting back, but it had one advantage. It was theirs to control for just a little while longer. "Volan," Darnak snapped, his voice cutting through the growing murmur of the crew. "Set the shields to cycle, opposite the pulse's pattern. We're going to use the ebb to break free." Volan's fingers hesitated over the controls. "But, Captain, the shielding's designed to absorb, not to repel. We could destabilize everything. Our own ship might break apart." Darnak's gaze hardened. "It's the only chance we have. If we don't act now, we'll be crushed under this force. We adapt, or we die here." Malin, his expression tight with understanding, nodded and began adjusting the parameters. The crew fell into motion, working with purpose but not without hesitation. They had never been trained for this. They were battling an enemy that defied all conventional warfare, an enemy that didn't fight with weapons, but with an entire cosmos that bent at its will. The Fury's end groaned again, the strain building to a near-deafening crescendo. Darnak felt every vibration, every subtle shift through his bones. The ship had become a living entity, its every movement tied to the pulse outside. But it was more than a battle against force. It was a fight for control, for time, for the very essence of their survival. "Shields cycling now, Captain," Volan called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The flickering monitors hummed to life, the shields adjusting in a precise rhythm. It was a calculated gamble, a temporary solution, but a solution nonetheless. Darnak nodded, his eyes locked on the viewport. The dark shape loomed larger, its presence becoming impossible to ignore. The pulse was relentless, but now there was a flicker of resistance. The shields were doing their job. They weren't breaking the pulse, just holding it at bay for now. The ship moved incrementally, inching away from the pull, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. "Now," Darnak said, the word clipped, final. "Increase power to the aft thrusters. Full reverse." Volan hesitated, his fingers flying over the console. "Reverse thrusters at max output? It's risky, Captain. The pulse might—" "Do it." Darnak's voice was firm, unwavering. They had one shot. "All systems on full throttle. We push back now." With a sudden jolt, the Fury's end lurched backwards, the thrusters kicking into full gear. The ship groaned under the strain as the pulse fought back, but this time they had leverage. The shields were in place, the thrusters engaged, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the ship moved, fighting its way out, inch by hard-earned inch. But Darnak knew the question that lingered. How long would it last? The pulse was relentless, and they were still far from free. The Fury's end trembled violently, the pulse outside intensifying in waves, pushing the ship to its very limits. Darnak's grip on the command console tightened, his knuckles turning white as the ship bucked under the weight of the unknown force. The hull creaked in protest, the structure straining against the pressure. He could feel the vibrations in his bones, a low, relentless thrum that seemed to vibrate through the air, making everything feel fragile, on the edge of breaking. But despite the overwhelming force, the ship had not succumbed. The pulse, while fierce, had not torn them apart. Yet. They were still moving, inching closer to something they couldn't yet see, but felt deep in their core. "Captain," Malin's voice was sharp, the tension in his tone unmistakable. "We're almost at the edge of the pulse. The shields are weakening. We're fighting time here." Darnak didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the viewport, his mind running through the calculations, running through the plan they had executed. No, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting. He could feel the weight of it, every person on this ship now a part of something larger. No one had asked for this battle. No one had asked to be tested like this, to face something so far beyond their understanding. But here they were. The ship lurched again, this time violently. The crew gasped, bracing themselves. But Darnak was already moving, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Push the thrusters harder. Give everything we have left. Now." Malin and Volan didn't hesitate. Their fingers flew across the console, manipulating the systems, pushing the ship past its breaking point. Every second stretched like an eternity, the coldness of space outside pressing in, but inside, Darnak's pulse matched the rhythm of the battle. He could feel it. It was as though the entire universe had watched the Toxans crumble, had watched as they fought an enemy they couldn't understand. But now they had made their stand. And against all odds, they had not just survived, they had fought. The ship groaned again, louder this time, but it wasn't just the ship protesting. It was the sound of resistance, of a vessel pushing beyond what it was meant to endure. The pulse outside flared once more, and the shields faltered, their last line of defense buckling under the weight. The dark shape of the unknown entity outside swelled, like a beast, ready to strike. But just as Darnak thought they had reached the edge, just as he thought the weight of it would crush them, the ship lurched again, but this time it wasn't against them. A sudden force, sharp and unmistakable, blasted through the pulse. It was so powerful that Darnak had to brace himself against the console, his vision swimming for a moment. Then, silence. The hum of the pulse had vanished. The ship was still. No more trembling, no more pressure. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the stillness of the void. We broke through, Malin said, his voice almost a whisper, disbelief lacing his words. Darnak's gaze remained fixed on the viewport, the stars slowly returning to their rightful place, as if the universe itself had exhaled a long-held breath. He could feel it. He had never doubted this moment, never doubted the strength of his crew, of his ship. They had been tested, pushed beyond their limits, but they had come through stronger, more defiant than ever before. He turned slowly, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of what they had just overcome. "We may not have asked for this fight, but we proved something today," Darnak said, his eyes locking with Malin, with Volan, with every soul on board. "We fought, we survived, and when the universe thought it had us, we showed it who we are. We are humanity, and nothing, not even the void itself, will break us." In that moment, the crew of the Fury's End understood what it meant. They had not just fought for survival, they had fought for the future, for the right to exist, to carve their place in the stars, and in doing so, they had proven that no force, no matter how ancient, could stand against them. The stars outside the viewport had returned, their distant light twinkling once again, unshaken by the weight that had threatened to crush them. The Fury's End was still, the calm after the storm settling over the ship like a heavy, aching breath. Darnak stood at the command console, his eyes fixed on the now serene void of space, but inside, the storm raged. They had survived. They had fought. But something deep within him told him this was just the beginning. The crew moved quietly behind him, the tension still hanging in the air, but the fear was gone. The pulse, the force that had threatened to tear them apart, had dissipated, but what they had witnessed would linger long after the danger had passed. They had not just fought an enemy. They had fought the very fabric of the universe itself, and they had won. "Captain," Malin's voice broke the silence, his tone steady but heavy. "The unknown force is gone, but we're still floating in uncharted space. We have no idea what lies ahead." Darnak finally turned from the viewport, meeting Malin's gaze with a hard, unflinching stare. "We don't need to know what's ahead," he said, his voice quiet but full of authority. "What matters is that we are here. We are standing. The universe thought it could crush us, thought it could break us, but we've shown it otherwise." Malin's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a flicker of pride shone through the uncertainty. "We didn't just survive, Captain," he said, his voice firm. "We proved something. We proved that humanity has no limits." Darnak nodded, a slow, solemn understanding settling between them. He looked out at the stars again as if seeing them for the first time. The vastness of space stretched before him, limitless, full of promise. They had taken their first steps into the unknown, and against all odds, they had not only held their ground, they had made their mark. "The universe may be vast, and we may be small," Darnak said, his voice rising, gaining strength with every word. "But we've just shown it that we will not be erased. We will not be forgotten. We will not be crushed. Volan's voice came next, quiet, but filled with a newfound respect. We've survived worse than this before, and we'll do it again. A deep silence settled over the bridge. The crew gathered around Darnak, their faces resolute, their eyes locked in shared understanding. They had crossed a line, a threshold, and had emerged on the other side stronger. There was no going back now. They had proven what humanity was capable of. They were more than survivors. They were warriors, driven not by the fear of the unknown, but by the will to carve their place among the stars. Humanity's final plea, Darnak said, his voice low but firm, was not one of desperation. It was one of strength. And today, we showed the universe that it had no idea what it had just awoken. The Fury's End drifted onward, no longer an insignificant speck in the vastness of space. It was a symbol, a beacon, and the universe would hear it. Humanity's future had just begun, and it was unstoppable,